Welcome to object creation. We've already seen this in previous sessions, so let's just bring it all together. There is the variable declaration on this side. There's the new keyword here. Then there is the call to the constructor, which initializes the object. So variable declaration, creating the object, or what you might call sometimes instantiating the object. So the word creating object and instantiating object, they're used to mean the same thing in different instances. Then a call to the constructor, which is just to initialize the object. So let's walk through that. The variable declaration is similar to any other declaration that you'd have in Java. So this is the format, data type, then the name. We use the name to reference that object, then the data type to have the data type for the object. So if it were a simple example for a primitive data type, it would be something like this: the data type and the name. The declaration remains like that at all instances in Java. So we'll talk more about this when you're creating a primitive data type declaration, or when you have a primitive data type declaration, it reserves memory for that variable. We'll talk more about the size of the types of data, because there is the particular size you'd have for int, another one for byte, and so on and so forth. So we'll look at that later. Now, for database, for object declaration, it doesn't reserve memory. What it does is it just creates a pointer. And at this point, given that it's just a declaration, it points to nothing. It is not referencing anything. So this is not a primitive data type, it's a reference data type. And with this kind of declaration, it's not referencing anything. Unlike if it were a primitive data type, which we'll talk about later, then the size of int would already be known ahead of time, and then it will reserve the memories by that size. So just to represent this, it will be like an empty box of a particular size that can store the object, the year value in it. So for reference, for objects, it's just a reference pointing nowhere. Now, if we want to proceed on with that, so we can have our object reference pointing to something useful, next step is the new keyword. So this is where this is the keyword that creates the objects or instantiates the object. What it does is it allocates memory for your object, and then it returns a reference to that memory. And it also requires us to invoke the constructor by having this call to the constructor right after it. Now, sometimes in code, you might feel like you won't be reusing this object several times. So instead of creating an object, then referencing that object to invoke a method or to call a field for a particular blueprint, you may just decide to store everything in one variable. For example, in our code, the one that we've been working with so far in the database blueprint or the database class, you could just use this new keyword, make a call to the class, and then make a call to the field database if it's within your code. So in that case, you could just store that in a string by the name. So we have string password equals to new database, then you're referencing database. So let me just rename this to password because we actually have password in our code. We're referencing password. So what that will do is, in our database class, we have this string here. Currently it's private, so we're just working with the assumption that it is still public as it were before. Or let me pick one that is not private, string username. So sometimes you might feel like I won't need to reuse this more than once, so you can just create it directly, make an invocation to it. So string username equals to new database, then you call username like that. So sometimes if you're sure you won't need to reuse the object from the data use the object more than once, you can just set it to an actual data type, like in our example here. Yeah, so string password. So if it were an int, it will be int, whatever the value is or the variable name is equals to new database, then you make a call to that field, so you know. All right, now to initialize the object, you call it. So a call to that constructor, that is the one that initializes the object. We have a visual representation of that, how it would look like. It's the Oracle reference is now pointing to a database object. Now, in one of the constructors, we had parameters in it, which means that when you're creating the constructor, you'll need to pass in arguments. Now, this is an example, a very simple example, because in our actual code, we're using strings. So bear with me on this one. We have an example here where, let's say we have a database constructor that is expecting us to pass in integer arguments. So for example, 1, 2, 3. What it would look like is you'd have your MySQL by the name here, MySQL reference pointing to a database object with these values 1, 2, 3 by their parameter names. So string value, connection value, start username value, start password value. The reason why I use the example with integer, it's more simple, given that a string is an object reference, and I didn't want to complicate the diagram. So in our code, we have strings, not integers. I just wanted to simplify our example. So string, start connection string, start username string, start password string. And if I were to use it like this, start connection string pointing to URLs, admin, and whatever password this is, in the visual representation, it will look like this. But for string, it would mean that it will be yet another reference point. That's why I didn't want to complicate it. We'll talk more about data types later on and see what that is. But I hope this clears that out. So we have the variable declaration, the new keyword, and the call to the constructor. And when you are referencing something, you use the dot operator. So this right here, this dot after the object itself, it's called the dot operator, and it's the one we use to access fields or to invoke methods from the blueprint. See you on the next one.